Let's take a look at some files and folders in our root user's home directory. Using the long listing, we can see all of the file and folder permissions for everything in the root user's home directory. Take a look at the permissions for the vim-test.txt file. As we can see here, there is a dash in front, indicating that it is a regular file, that the root user, which is the owner, has both read and write permissions, the group has read permissions, and the world has read permissions. Let's modify the permissions on this file to grant the avance user the ability to modify it. First, we will copy the file to Avance's home directory since she won't have access to the /root directory. And we will double check the permissions of the file. We see that the owner of the file is root, so Avance will not be able to change the permissions on the file so that she could write to it. Only root will be able to do so, since root is the owner. The tool that we use to modify file and folder permissions is chmod, or the change mode command. We can modify a file's permissions either using symbols or by numbers with the chmod command. We will start with the symbols. We run the chmod command, specifying O for other, and we are adding the write permission to the vim test file. Then we log in as Avance, and we verify that we can read the file. And since Avance has write permissions to the file, we will modify the file from the Avance account. Back in the root account, we wish to take away the ability for Avance to write to this file. We can do this using the chmod command and by changing the octal value of the permissions on the file. Let's modify the permissions so that only root can read and write to this file. We can see that only root has read and write access to the file. If you remember from the previous video, 600 is equal to read and write and no permissions for the group or for the other users, which is what we have here. Just read and write for the owner, no permissions for the group, and no permissions for others. Let's try and read the file from the Avance account. And we are denied access. You might be wondering, where do the default permissions come from on a RHEL system? These default permissions come from the umask, or User File Creation Mode Mask value. You can view your default umask value with the umask command. Here we see that our umask value is set to 0022. Bash gets this value from the /etc/profile script. Umask works like this. A file has a default set of permissions of 666. We take our umask value and subtract that from 666 to get our user default file permissions of 644. Let's try this. Here we are just creating an empty file. Now let's take a look at the permissions of that file. And we can see that the file's permissions are set to 644, or read write, read, read. The same principle applies to a directory. A directory's base permissions are 777. So by subtracting our umask value from that of 022, we end up with 755. See the difference between the file and directory permissions? And that is where the default file and folder permissions come from.